Hi, and welcome to Module 102 of the Information Lab and Data School's Tableau Data Skills Training course. My name is Hannah Murphy, and I'll be running today's session with you.
In this module, you'll become familiar with the different types of calculation in Tableau and how to use them. I will also cover how to use parameters in our calculations and briefly introduce table calculations and level of detail expressions. You can watch this module as a standalone training or as part of our Tableau Data Skills series. If you find this training useful and would like us to help you and your team make sense of your business data, please reach out at info@theinformationlab.co.uk. Check the description for links to this module's training materials and also for other useful links that will help you level up your data skills. And remember to click subscribe to be the first to know about our new videos. Okay, let's jump right in and get started.
I'm going to start by opening the Starter Workbook in Tableau. As previously mentioned, this will be available to download in the description of this video. If you haven't already downloaded it, please pause the video now to do so. Once you've opened the workbook, you should see a table like the one on my screen. Today we'll be using a holiday spending dataset to practice our calculations, looking at the money spent by individuals on gifts for their friends and family. There are three ways in which you can create a calculated field in Tableau, which I'm going to quickly demonstrate. You can go via the data pane on the left here and right-click on any field and go down to Create and then Calculated Field. Also within the data pane, you can go up to this little drop down here and click Create Calculated Field. And finally, along the menu bar, if you go to Analysis, you can also go all the way down and find the Create Calculated Field option. Clicking on any of these will open up the calculation window that looks a little bit like this. This is where you'll write all your calculations. On the top up here is where you will name your calculation. Tableau will default to calculation 1, but you should always rename your calculations so you can easily find them in the data pane and also remember what they do when time passes. The white space just below is where you will write your calculations. We'll look into that in more detail in just a moment.
And on the right here is a sort of help pane that will help provide assistance on how to write your calculations. So if, for example, I wanted to write a string function, I would go to the drop down up here, select string,
And have a look down the list. Let's say I wanted to use the lower function. You'll see on the right here when I click on it, there's a bit of a guideline on how to format my calculation. There are four types of calculated field in Tableau. There are row level calculations, aggregated calculations, table calculations, and level of detail expressions. Table calculations and level of detail expressions will be briefly mentioned at the end of this video. However, for a better understanding of what they are and how to use them, please see the relevant modules linked in the description. As I just mentioned, there are two general types of calculated fields. Row level calculations. This is when it is calculated for each row in the data set. Row level results are then aggregated just like normal fields. The other type is an aggregated calculation where the measures are first aggregated and the calculation is then run on the aggregated result. We're going to look at two examples of these using the table sheet. So the first one that we're going to look at is the row level calculation. And to do that, we're just going to calculate a total field for each record in our data set. So the first thing we're going to do is name our field total, and then we're going to start writing our calculation. So we want to add together all the different types of gifts and their value to get our total. So the first one I'm going to do is gifts for family, and you'll see it pops up here, and if I just click on it, it will be brought into the calculation. You'll notice that this is in an orange text. This is because it is a field. If your field name is not in an orange text with the square bracket format, it has not been brought in correctly and Tableau will not read it as a field. Then I'm just going to do a plus and I'm going to bring in my other fields. So I can continue to type them, or I can go to the data pane and I can drag the pills onto my calculation window like so. So if I do that and then another plus, bring in gifts for friends, and then finally other gifts. So now if I press OK, I will see I've got this field in the data pane, and if I just bring that onto measure values at the bottom, you'll see I've now got a column on the far right with the total. Row level calculations can be aggregated just like a normal measure. So, for example, sum, average, maximum, minimum, etc. But Tableau will default to sum, as we can see here. The second type of calculation we're going to look at an example of is an aggregated calculation. So we're going to build a percentage of gifts spent on family field. So to do this, once again, we are going to create a calculated field and we're going to call it percent of gifts on family. And we're just going to write out a quite simple calculation of gifts for family. And then we're going to divide it by our total. Okay, so this is actually a row level calculation that we've written right now. So I'm going to use this as an example so then you can compare it to how it would work if we had used an aggregated calculation as well. So if I click OK and I drag this back onto my measure values, you'll see that I have got a gifts for family column and it has been calculated to a sum. This is okay because we're going on a row level basis. And if I just right click on my pill and click format, I can change this into a percentage as so, and I can define the number of decimal places. So this does work in this context because of the granularity of our data. But let's imagine that we want to find out the percentage of gifts on family across the entire data set. So to do that, I am just going to make a new sheet and I'm going to bring in my percentage of gifts on family field onto text. And if I then format that back into a percentage, you will see that I've got about 4,000% spent on family. Now we know this can't be right. You can't spend that much on family out of the data set. So we know that we are not using the right calculation type here. And we do actually need to use an aggregated um, calculation type. So we're going to rebuild this calculation again. So we're going to create calculated field and we're going to call this percentage gifts on family and then AGG for aggregated. And what we're going to do this time is aggregate within the calculation. So the first thing we need is a sum function. You'll see it just pops up on your drop down there with the little f. So you need to make sure you click on that and then you get the text in blue, which defines it as a function. And we're going to drag in gifts for family in between those two brackets. Then we're going to divide by the sum again. So same process of our total. So what this is doing is giving you the total for all the gifts spent on family across the entire data set, and then it's dividing it by the total of all the totals across the data set as well. So now if I click OK on that, and I'm just going to double click on measure names to bring it in, and then I'm going to bring my aggregated percentage onto measure values. And immediately you'll see a difference in the number. If I right click and format it into a percentage as well, we'll see that we've now got about 77%, which is a lot more of a realistic number. So the aggregated field are not further aggregated. So you'll see when you brought it in, you've got this AGG rather than the sum. That means that your field has already been aggregated and cannot be aggregated further. The type of calculation you're using is important to think about. Sometimes a row level calculation is the right move, but you do need to be sure that you are using the correct one because, as we've just seen in this example, there is a big difference in numbers, and this can lead to quite an inaccurate or very inaccurate analysis. So I'm now going to go back to my table sheet and I'm going to run through some examples of some different types of calculation. So the first one we're going to look at are numerical calculations. And a numerical calculation can be done using any kind of mathematical function. So like we've seen, plus, subtract, multiply and divide, but there are also several numerical functions built into Tableau that we're going to look at. So our first example we're going to build is a boosted total. So I'm going to create a calculated field, which I'm going to call boosted total, and that is going to be my total times by 1.2. So I'm bringing in my total field, and then I am just going to multiply that by 1.2. And then if I click OK and drag my boosted total onto measure values as well, you'll see now that I have got an increased total compared to what there originally was. However, we've now got a decimal place.
And let's just say we want our numbers to be a whole number. We're going to have to use a numeric function, and that will be the round function.
So I'm going to go back into my data pane and I'm going to create another calculated field, which is going to be boosted total rounded. Ooh, misspelled that. And I'm going to use the round function. So if I go on round, you'll see that I get that little pop-up underneath my text and also an update on the help bar on the right. So the first thing we need to do is define what number we're rounding, and that will be our boosted total field. So I'm going to bring that in between the brackets. And you'll see that's now gone bold to show what we're currently filling in. Then I want to do a comma, and I just want to define how many decimal places I want. So in this case, it will be a 0. And then if I click OK and drag boosted total rounded next to my original boosted total, you'll see now that these have all been rounded to the nearest whole number. The next type of calculation we're going to look at are text calculations, otherwise known as a string. So the word string in Tableau does mean any kind of text field, and it is defined by the little ABC symbol next to your field name or pill. So there are loads of different types of text calculations. Most are used to either slightly edit the format of your field or extract part of it. So we're going to have a look at a couple of examples. So if I create a new calculated field, the first one I'm going to do is to extract the first initial of the first name. So I'm going to call this first initial, and I'm just going to do a very simple calculation using the left function. So same as before, start typing left, enter on the function so it's in that blue text, and you'll see here again that little pop-up that tells you what you need to do.
So the first thing we need to do is tell Tableau which field we want to apply the function to.
So in this case, that will be name, and then you want to define how many characters you want to extract from that string. So that will be a comma and 1. So that's saying start at the left on the name field and take one character, which will be the first character. Now, if I click OK and I drag that next to my name field on the rows shelf, you'll see I've extracted just the first initial for every single name. The next calculation I'm going to look at is the length calculation. So this is a little bit different because it will return a numerical field from a string field. Just done a new calculation and I'm just going to call this name length. And I'm going to use the len function. So len, length, and I'm just going to define what string I want to take the length of, which again is name. So what this will do is return the number of characters in that given string as a numeric field. So now if I click OK and I drag name length into my measure values, you'll see Anne 4 characters, Sam 3 characters, etc. You will also note that Tableau has aggregated our name length field for us. That is fine in this case because we are just going on a row level. But it is worth considering if you are doing this across the data set, you might want to think about an average or a minimum or a maximum. A sum will just add together all of those numbers and you'll end up with a ridiculously high number that doesn't really mean anything. So the next type of calculated field we're going to look at are date calculations. So there are a variety of date calculations in Tableau. These can be used to add and subtract dates, work out the difference between two dates, extract parts of dates, and also be used within other logical calculations. So the first one we're going to look at is using the date add function, and we're going to create a new field that shows our year field plus 6 months. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a calculated field, which I'm going to call year plus 6 months. And then, as I just mentioned, I'm going to use the date add function, and you'll see that I require three parts to this function. So the first is the date part. This is your unit that you're going to be adding or subtracting. So in this case, months. So within quotations, I'm just going to put the lowercase word month and close my quotations. I'm then going to do a comma, and now I need to define how many months am I adding. So in this case, 6. If I wanted to subtract months, I would have to do -6. There is no date subtract function, you just do the negative of the date add. And then our final part is what is the date field we are doing this to? And in this case, that is our year field. Now, it's important if you've got a date field called year, you need to make sure that you select the right one. So you can see here on the top, I've got year with that little green calendar symbol. That is our field. Underneath is the year function. So we don't want to bring that in because it won't actually work. So now if I click on this, click OK, I can right click on my blue pill and drag it onto the screen. And I can click on my first one here to make it discrete. So what we can see now is that I've got the 1st of January 2004 as my original field, and then added 6 months, 1st of July 2004 here. Now we can see that this is a date time field. So if I wanted to remove this midnight timestamp, I can right click on my field, click format, and just change the format here. So because these are currently in an American format, I can go on to custom and do DD/MM/year, 4 years. And if I come off that now, you'll see that my dates are in a consistent format. The next type we're going to look at is extracting part of a date. So in this case, let's say we want to extract our month name from our year field. So to do that, we're going to create a new calculated field, and we're going to call this month name. Okay. And we're just going to use the date name function. So you can see it down here, and it returns part of a specified date as a string field, which is what we want. So again, you'll recognize that date part. That will be our month again, because we would like to return month. And then of our date field, which is year again. And that start of the week at the end is optional. We do not need it for this calculation. You'll see it at the bottom. Our calculation is valid and therefore will work. So now if I click OK and drag month name on, you'll see I've now got the word January for all of our dates that are in January. And the last type we're going to look at under date calculations are using date calculations within other logical statements. So I'm going to create a new calculated field. And what I want to do here is create a field that will define whether or not our date is within the last 2 years or older than that. So I'm going to write an if statement, which I'm going to call within last 2 years. And as the name implied, I'm going to start this calculation off with an if, and I'm going to make sure I've clicked the if function. And then I'm going to define my logic. So this is the thing that Tableau is going to look at to assign a category or a result. So this is now going to be a date diff function. And this basically will calculate the difference between two dates. So I want it to say between day, so count how many days are between my start date, which is year, the field, and my end date, which is today. So Tableau does actually have a function for this. It's called now, and you'll see it there as a function. If you enter on that, you'll get a blue field with two brackets, but that is fine. You don't need to worry about putting anything in between it. And that will return the current date and time for your machine. So I've now defined my conditional statement, but I need to know what about the date diff? How many days? So I want to say if my date diff is less than or equal to 730, which is 2 years worth of days, then, so what do you want Tableau to do if it meets that condition? And we want it to say within last 2 years. And we want that in quotation marks because it will be a string. Then we just need to tell Tableau, what if it doesn't meet that condition? What if it is false? So that will be our else. And then we'll say in quotations again, older than that. And again, you'll see that's grayed out text. And then our final step is an end. So when writing our if statements, we need these four parts. You need the if, and then whatever your condition is, whatever your true or false question is, then your then, which is what if that statement is true, and your else, which is your other. So what do we do with everything that doesn't match that statement? And then you bracket it off with an end. If I remove the end, you'll see that I get this little error message at the bottom, which says it's expecting an end to match our if. So it's identifying that this is an incomplete if statement. So if I put my end back in and click OK, and I drag this field on, you'll see now that we've got older than that next to all of the fields that are older than 2 years. So that's everything from our date calculation examples. The next one we're going to look at are logical calculations. So that would be another if statement. And this time we're going to look at something a little bit more complicated. So I'm going to create a new calculated field again, and I'm going to call this spent over 600. And what I want to do here is create three results or three categories. I want to define if our total is over 600 and say over. I want to define if our total is under 600 and say under. And then if it's bang on 600, I just want it to write the word 600. That's going to mean there's an additional step in our if statement that I will walk you through now. I write the beginning of my if statement, so if and its total greater than 600. Then I'm going to do my then, say over. That's my first part complete. If the total meets this condition, over. So then I'm going to do an else if. And this basically adds an additional statement. So it's saying, check my first statement, assign over. Else if, so if my total less than 600, then under. So now we've got, if it meets this condition, do this. Otherwise, if it meets this other condition, do this. And then our last step is to then provide the other, which is the else. And we want that to be 600 within quotation marks.
Because we want it to be read as a string and not a whole number for the calculation to work. So then once we've got all our components, all we need to do is finish off with an end.
Now if I click OK and I drag that field on next to my first initial, you'll see I've now got under, and if I look at my total, that is under 600. Where I've got 600 here, if I follow along, that is exactly 600. And where I've got over, if I follow that row along, that is also over 600. So that's it from our logical calculations. Our next one will be a Boolean calculation. So a Boolean is basically a true or false. So an example of this is, do I want to pull out everyone whose name is Sam? So I need to write a calculation which is called, let's just name it Sam question mark. And all I want to do is write a single statement which will either be true or false. So let's say name equals and then Sam in quotations. So this is case sensitive, so you need to make sure you write Sam exactly how it is in the data, otherwise it will not return a true. And then I'm just going to click OK. Now if I drag this on next to name, you'll see you've got a true next to all the instances where name equals Sam and a false in all the others. If I wanted to look at only Sam's data, I could then drag this pill onto filters and select true and OK, and then I would see only Sam's data. So that's an example of a Boolean with a string. We can also use it with numeric fields. So I'm just going to remove that from filters and create a new calculated field, which I'm going to call gifts for friends over 75. And same as before, I'm just going to write a simple statement that is either true or false. So I'm going to drag in my gifts for friends field, and then I'm just going to do greater than 75. So as before, when we wanted our numbers within quotation marks, so Tableau recognized them as a string. In this case, we want it to be outside of quotation marks because we're applying a mathematical function to this number 75, and we want it to be read as a number. Now, if I click OK and I drag in my gifts for friends over 75 pill onto the rows, you'll see I've got true here, and that is 81. So that's over 75, and false under 71, which is less. So those are all of the examples that I was going to run through with you. If you want to go over to the next sheet on the bottom, this tab here, we're going to go through some exercises. So I will explain each exercise to you, and then I will pause slightly to give you a chance to pause the video and attempt it yourself before we run through it. So the first example that I'm going to ask you to do is to extract the first two letters of the first name. So if you want to have a go, pause the video now. Hopefully everyone had a go. And I'm going to now just create the calculated field to show you how it works. So I'm going to call this field first two initials, and much the same as we did before in the demo, I'm going to use left name, comma, and this time it's going to be a 2 because we want the first two initials. And I'm just going to click OK. And then if I just drag that on next to the name, we'll see now that we've got the first two initials for each person. Hopefully everybody got that. It's a relatively simple one. And now we're going to go on to our second question, which is numeric calculations. So what I'm going to ask you to do here is think about the average amount spent and how you could calculate that for each row. So if you want to have a go, pause the video now. So what we want to do is create our calculated field, and we're going to call this average amount. And the first thing we want to do is add together the amount spent. So we could use our total field that we created before and drag that on, or we can just add together our gift fields. So I'm going to do that just to demonstrate how we would structure it, and that needs to be within a bracket. So the first step is to open a bracket, and then you're bringing in gifts for coworkers plus gifts for family plus gifts for friends plus other gifts. And then you need to close that bracket. So this is very similar to what you would do if you were just doing this as a maths equation. You need to tell Tableau to add all of these fields together first before you do anything else. And then to find our average, all we need to do is divide it by the number of fields we've got there. So in this case, that would be 4, and then click OK and drag that into our measure values field. And now you'll see we've got this column on the far right, which shows the average amount spent per person per date on gifts. Again, this is a row level calculation, and that is fine because we want to do this on a row level basis. So for the third question, if we just want to go onto this exercise 3 sheet, we're going to do a date calculation. And what we want to do here is adjust our year date by 15 days for all dates from 2013 and beyond. So we want to do a couple of date functions within an if statement. So pause the video now if you want to have a go. I'm going to wait a second and then I'll run through it. Okay, so to do this, we need to, unsurprisingly, create a calculated field. And we're just going to call this date adjusted. Correct that. And we need to start building out our if function. So the first thing we want to say is, does the year equal 2013? So we're going to do if, and then we're going to use that year function I mentioned earlier and say extract the year of our year field. And we're going to say, is that greater than or equal to 2013? Okay. And then what do we do if it is? If it is, then, and you'll want to add 15 days. So we're going to do date add day, 15 of them to your year field. And then if it doesn't meet that condition, what is our else? And our else will be just leave it as the original year field. And we're going to click end. Now, if I click OK and I drag that on into my text, and I want it as a discrete, hasn't come through right, so I will want to go on to day and then convert it to discrete. You'll see now I've got my adjusted date for anything that's 2013 or beyond. So I've got my 1st of January here, 2013, and we've added 15 days and made that the 16th of January. If we wanted to, we could then format it as well. So go back into our format pane and change the structure using our custom. So dd/mm/4ys, just to keep things consistent. So that's the date calculation exercise. And the last one we're going to do, if we go on to exercise 4, is a Boolean calculation. So what we want to know here is, does the name contain an uppercase W? So if you want to have a go, pause the video. I will wait a moment and then we'll continue. Our calculated field this time, if I call this W question mark, is going to use the contains function. So that's contains. And you'll see we've got here string and substring. So string refers to our original field that we want to look at, in which case that is name. And our substring is almost our target. What is the thing we are looking for within that field to get a true result? So if I do a comma and I write capital W, close quotations. This is also case sensitive, so you need to make sure that you use the correct one. And then if I click OK and I drag that onto there, you'll see I've got true for Will and false for Anne and Sam, which have no uppercase W in it. So that's all our exercises for this section. Hopefully everyone had a go and at least got some way towards the right answer if you didn't get it exactly right. So if we return to our original screen with our objectives for today's session, we've now come to the end of point 1, which is to become familiar with the different types of calculation in Tableau and look at some examples of how we can use them. Our next one is learning about how we can use parameters in our calculations. So what are parameters? Parameters are useful when you want to add interactivity and flexibility to a report or a dashboard. So suppose you're unsure which fields to include in your view or which layout would work best for your viewers, you can incorporate parameters into your view to let viewers choose how they want to look at their data. So this can be a user-generated value or be taken from an existing field. We can use parameters in calculations and calculated fields that are then used in the view, and we will be using a couple of pre-made parameters within a few types of calculations to demonstrate how they can be used with what we've learned so far. For more information on building and using parameters, please refer to Module 203 in our Data Skills series. The link will be provided in the video description. So now if I go back into my starter workbook, I'm going to go on this sheet called Name Parameter. And this is a parameter we are going to use to filter our view to show only a chosen name. So if I right click on Select Name Parameter and click Show Parameter, you'll see it's been preloaded with all of the names in our data set. But right now, if I click on it, it doesn't really do anything. And that is because we've not provided the link between our parameter and our data. So what I want to do is create a Boolean calculation using my parameter. So I'm going to create a calculated field and I'm going to call this selected name and with a quotation mark. And all I'm going to do, much as before, is do my name field and then an equals. And then if I wanted to hard code this, I could just put, for example, will in quotations, and that would be my Boolean that I would then use in my filters. However, we want this to be dynamic and change when the parameter value changes. So instead of hard coding a name, I'm going to put select name parameter. And you'll see that's now purple text. All parameters will be brought through as purple. If it is not purple and you're expecting it to be a parameter, you're using the wrong field. So now I've got a calculation that says, is the name in the data set equal to the current value of our name parameter? So in this case, that would be Sam, and that will provide a Boolean. So if I click OK and I drag selected name onto my filters and I want it to show true only, and click OK, you'll see now that our data has been filtered to show only Sam, which is the name on our parameter. If I then change that to Anne, you'll see that my view has been filtered and changed to show only Anne. So that's the first of our parameter examples. The next one we're going to look at is this target parameter sheet. So you'll see that we've got here a line chart by year showing the total of gifts for family for only Anne. So let's imagine we want to highlight all of the points that have a value over what we're going to call our target field. So what we're going to do here is create a calculated field called above target, question mark. And I'm just going to show you how it'd look if I hard coded the number. So I'm going to do my sum of gifts for family because we do want it to be aggregated. And then I'm going to say, is it above, let's say, 400? And if I then click OK and drag that onto color, you'll see every instance where it's true, I've now got that orange color there. But let's say I want my target to change with the user input. I can use my target amount parameter. So if I right click on this and do show parameter, I've now got my target amount, which is a free entry point. So now if I go back into my above target calculation and edit it, I'm going to remove that hard coded number and I'm going to say use the target amount parameter. So I just zoom in on that so you can see it. I've got then my blue function, sum, gifts for family, my orange field, and then my target amount value. And then if I click OK on that, you'll see now that it is only the values above 500 that have been colored in that orange color for true. And if I change this to say be 600, you'll see that none of my points are now colored in that orange color because no one has exceeded that target. And then if I change it to say 350, you'll see that my true color has apparently changed to blue, but all of my values are now showing as true. We can also use this color format within our table structure. So if I go back to my name parameter sheet, and instead of using my selected name as a filter and I use it on a color, you will now see I've got orange for all the cases where Anne is the name and blue for all the cases where Anne is not. And then if I change my parameter, you'll see that the color updates with that too. And the last one we're going to look at is a slightly different type of filter parameter. So this is going to be a top N parameter. So if I right click on my filter parameter here and click show parameter, you'll see I've got a slider with an entry value. So this is going to be used to filter my results to show a top N amount by a field that's defined. So if I drag my year field, if I right click on it and drag it to filters and say to use month, day, year, and then I'm going to use this top tab and say top certain amount by, and then it's going to be gifts for family, and the aggregation will be a sum. So if I leave it as is, that will be a hard coded amount. It will always show the top 10. But if I'd like to use my parameter, if I click on this drop down, you'll see I've got my filter parameter here. And if I click on that and click OK, you'll see I've now got my top 10 results. And if I increase that parameter value, you'll see the number of records are increasing and vice versa. So that is everything on using parameters in calculations that I've got to show you for this video. Again, as I previously mentioned, if you want to learn how to create a parameter and configure it, and also see some more complicated examples, I would recommend going on to our parameter module in the Data Skills series. So if I once again return to my training objective slides, we'll see now that we've completed number 1 and number 2. So to become a little bit more familiar with how we can use parameters in our calculations. I'm now going to have a look at introducing table calculations and level of detail expressions at a very basic level. Because as I previously mentioned with parameters, there are modules dedicated to exploring these to their fullest later on in our course. So the first thing we're going to look at are level of detail expressions, otherwise known as LODs. These allow you to compute values at a data source level and at the visualization level. So they allow you to control granularity. And there are three types of LOD. You've got a fixed LOD. This will calculate everything at an independent level. So irrespective of what is on the view, it will be computed to the level that you have defined when writing the calculation. Include makes your data more granular. So you can add additional fields to what is in the view to create a more granular calculation. And the opposite of that is exclude, which will make it less granular. So you can then calculate, say, with the data we had before, everything to the year level and ignore the names. And then you would just have a yearly total multiplied down. And you can use that then to, say, calculate a percentage of the year value based off then the value you've got per record. So the video for level of detail expressions is Tableau 201, and that can be found within our playlist later on. And then the last thing we're going to quickly look at are table calculations. So table calculations are a special type of calculated field that is calculated based on what is currently in the visualization and do not consider any measures that are not on the view. So table calculations are computed after the initial query, allowing users to do something with the results produced on the view. You need to dictate which direction the table calculation works, and that will be your addressing fields. And you also need to define how the data will be grouped. So what dimensions do you want to use to group that calculated field? And that is called partitioning. You can add a table calculation by right-clicking on the field once it's in the view, and you have multiple options, some of which include ranking. So you can have a rank on a value and then restart it at every category. That would be your partitioning field. Or you can also do a running total, moving average, a percentage of total, and a difference from previous. And you can also then define whether that will be your previous cell, so literally the next one across, or it could also be a previous year, which would look further back in your data. Again, a very brief overview, and you want to look at Tableau 202, Table Calculations, for more information. Again, that will be later on in the playlist, as well as linked below the video.
Thank you for watching this module. I've had a great time teaching you. In this module, we covered table calculations, as well as looking at using parameters in calculations and introducing table calculations and level of detail expressions. I hope you're able to put what you learned in this module into practice soon. If you want to continue with our Tableau Data Skills training course, the next module is Dashboards 103. You can jump straight to it by clicking on the next video thumbnail on the right, and any additional modules I've referenced will be linked in the video description. And if you'd like us to help you and your team boost your data skills, please reach out at info@theinformationlab.co.uk. Thank you very much for watching.